There are moments in history when something everyone thought they understood suddenly flips upside down. Moments when a familiar doorway opens into a room no one expected. That's exactly what happens the first time someone looks closely at the DNA of America's earliest founders. Because the story the world grew up with, the one carved into monuments and printed in school books, goes something like this. Europeans crossed the ocean, planted a flag, and built a new nation. Clean, simple, familiar. But the reality? The story written in their blood? It's older, messier, and far more astonishing. When researchers take the most influential early Americans, presidents, revolutionaries, founders, and run their DNA through modern tools, the results don't point only to England or Scotland. They point to North Africa. They point to the Levant. They reveal unexpected indigenous lines. They uncover forgotten Moorish converts, Sephardic Jews fleeing persecution, Mediterranean sailors, and even markers that trace back to ancient migrations across Central Asia. These are not fringe ideas. These are published haplogroups, documented genealogies, and thousands of modern descendants carrying markers historians never expected to see. And it forces a deeper question. If the people who shaped America came from so many corners of the world, then who actually built this nation? And how much of America's identity rests on stories that were never fully true? Before the story goes further, this is exactly the kind of truth revealed every day on GenealogyX, where history meets DNA. Viewers who want to uncover the stories written in their own blood should subscribe now. Now the layers begin to peel back. Imagine the eastern seaboard in the early 1600s, the cold Atlantic wind, the creaking of wooden ships packed with families carrying hopes and secrets. Many settlers weren't purely English at all. Mediterranean mixing, Spanish, Basque, Moorish, Sephardic, had already shaped European populations long before these families ever imagined crossing the ocean. When their Y-DNA is mapped today, haplogroups like EM78, TM70, JM267, and GP15 appear, lineages far more common in the Middle East and North Africa than in Northern Europe. Yet these markers show up in early Virginia, the Carolinas, even New England. These weren't anomalies. They were the quiet echoes of centuries of movement around the Mediterranean. Then, an even older surprise emerges. Some early Europeans already carried faint Native American DNA, not from the Americas, but from Viking contact 1,000 years earlier. A tiny fraction of Norse and Icelandic people today hold ancient indigenous markers. Those lineages traveled back to Europe, mixed for centuries, and eventually made their way into families that would later help settle the colonies. Meaning some European founders unknowingly carried American ancestry long before they ever reached American shores. The story deepens again. Geneticists studying autosomal data found small but unmistakable West African DNA segments in the descendants of several colonial-era families, including lines tied to early statesmen. The early Atlantic world was not neat. Africans were present earlier than most realize, some enslaved, some free, some intermarried, some absorbed quietly into frontier communities. Their stories rarely entered official records, but DNA remembered every step. Another hidden layer belongs to the Sephardic Jews of early America. Many arrived under changed identities, Portuguese, Dutch, New Christians, escaping the shadow of the Inquisition. Their haplogroups appear today in families who never imagined their ancestors once lit Shabbat candles in secret centuries earlier. And then comes the Melungeon story, one of America's most misunderstood groups. Their DNA reveals a blend of European, Indigenous American, African, and Mediterranean roots. For generations, they were labeled mysterious, but modern genetics shows exactly what they represented. Early America was already far more mixed than society later wanted to admit. Then the story flips again. Several early Virginia Y-DNA lineages show clear Middle Eastern or North African origins, markers nearly non-existent in Northern Europe. And these weren't isolated men. Some of these lines intermarried with families that, decades later, intersected with political and cultural leadership, which means part of America's early foundation carries bloodlines that reach back to the Levant, to Berber North Africa, to ancient Jewish communities. Now, picture daily life in early America. Rough trading posts, dirt roads, struggling farms, and isolated cabins. People weren't walking around thinking in strict racial categories, not the way later generations would. Those boundaries hardened gradually through laws and social pressure. In the earliest decades, survival blurred lines, communities mixed, children were born to connections the written record refused to acknowledge. On the frontier, Indigenous and European lineages intertwined almost immediately. Many early traders, soldiers, and interpreters were of mixed heritage, though history often skips over their names. Their descendants today sometimes have no idea their bloodline traces to tribes displaced by epidemic, migration, and war. Then a deeper layer of Eurasian history appears. Some European settlers carried rare branches of steppe ancestry, tied not just to Indo-European migrations, but to ancient peoples of the Caucasus or the Iranian plateau. These journeys stretched thousands of miles and thousands of years before anyone dreamed of a place called America, yet their blood ended up shaping the earliest chapters of this country. Think about the implication. The founders of America were not carved from a single mold. They were descendants of shepherds from the Caucasus, sailors from Morocco, merchants from Judea, farmers from West Africa, and indigenous families rooted here for millennia. Their lineages braided together long before the nation was even an idea. Yet society often imagines the founders as marble statues, pure, simple, uniform. But when the myth is peeled back, a different picture emerges. Human beings, mixed, complex, their DNA wandering across continents, carrying migrations they never learned about, and histories they themselves didn't know they carried. DNA today offers a new mirror. When people take a genetic test and find 1% North African ancestry or 2% Indigenous American or a trace of Sephardic Jewish line or West African lineage, their sense of identity shifts. Their story grows, their roots broaden. Suddenly, being American stops looking like a straight line and instead becomes a web connected to deserts, mountains, islands, caravans, ships, and ancient migration routes. And here's the part that lingers. America's founders had no idea. They never knew their DNA was a map of world history, but modern tools allow people to look back and see what they could not. Their bloodlines, the bloodlines of presidents, revolutionaries, farmers, sailors, and families who never made the textbooks, they are all threads in one enormous human tapestry. A story that begins in Africa, spreads through the Middle East, stretches across Europe, and finally crosses into this land. A story written in human beings. A story still unfolding. If viewers have enjoyed exploring how DNA overturns the myths of history, they can subscribe to GenealogyX. The channel uncovers 2 DNA mysteries every day that reveal who we really are.